Today, I want to talk about something that most people don't realize is directly connected to their calling, but it affects whether they can actually sustain their calling, and that's boundaries. Because a lot of people focus on discovering their purpose. People, they want clarity, they want direction, they want to know what God is calling them to do. But very few people ask the question, do I have the structure to protect my calling? Because calling will open doors. Calling will create opportunity. Calling will stretch you into new spaces. But calling, it's not going to protect you. And if you don't have boundaries in place, you can step into what God has for you and find yourself overwhelmed. You can find yourself drained or even pulled out of alignment. So today we're going to look at boundaries differently. Not as a restriction, not as something that limits your life, but as something that God uses to protect what He's building in you. So let's get into it. There's this assumption that once you know your calling, everything will fall into place. That clarity will fix everything. That purpose will create stability. But that's not actually how this works. Because you can know what you're called to do and still not have the structure to sustain it. You can step into opportunities and feel completely overwhelmed. You can be in the right place and still feel out of alignment. And it's not because your calling is wrong. It's because there's no protection around your calling. Calling without boundaries, it leads to burnout. If anyone had access to people, to needs, to opportunity, it was Jesus. People constantly needed him. Crowds followed him. There was always more he could do, but he didn't respond to everything. In Mark chapter 1, verse 35, after Jesus did many miracles, you see him step away to pray, even when people were actively looking for him. That's powerful because it shows that he didn't allow others to demand things of him or to dictate his direction. And in those moments, he withdrew. He rested. He moved on when people wanted him to stay, not because he didn't care, but because he was aligned with the Father. He understood that doing everything was not the same as doing what he was sent to do. So what do boundaries actually do? They protect your time. They protect your energy, your focus, your alignment. Because without boundaries, everything starts to compete for your attention. And here's the reality. Not everything that is good is God for you. Not every opportunity is yours to take. Not every need is yours to meet. And just because there's a door doesn't mean you have to walk through it. And without boundaries, you're going to say things that maybe you weren't supposed to say. And I think a lot of people struggle with the boundaries because they associate them with selfishness. They think, if I say no, I'm letting people down. If I don't show up, I'm being a bad friend. If I create space, I'm isolating, I'm being distant. But boundaries are not about pushing people away. They're about keeping your life aligned with the Father. Because if you don't protect your time will be taken. If you don't protect your energy, you're going to feel constantly drained. If you don't protect your focus, you'll feel scattered. And then you'll wonder, why do I feel overwhelmed in a life that God called me to? That's because boundaries are not just practical. Boundaries are very spiritual. Because everything that God gives you, you are responsible to steward. Your time, your energy, your calling, your capacity. And stewardship requires intentional limits. In Luke chapter 16, it says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. This is talking about being faithful for what you've been given. And part of faithfulness is not overextending yourself to things that God never asked you to carry. Because when you say yes to everything, you dilute what you were meant to carry. Because without boundaries, your life starts to feel heavy. Not because God gave you too much, but because you picked up things that weren't yours. And over time, that's going to lead out to burnout. You're going to feel resentment, maybe towards God, to other people, to yourself. You're going to be exhausted and confused. You start feeling disconnected from your purpose, even though you're doing a lot. And I think that's the trap. You can be busy and still be out of alignment. So, what does this look like in your life? Glad you asked. You need to see, where am I saying yes too quickly? Where do I feel constantly drained? Where do I feel pulled in too many directions? And then bring those to God. Because boundaries are not built out of guilt, they're built out of clarity. It might look like saying no to something that's good, but it's not from God. Not answering everything immediately. You're protecting your time. It restores you. Not overcommitting your energy. And yes, it's gonna feel uncomfortable at first because you're breaking the cycle. You're breaking patterns. Discomfort doesn't mean that it's wrong. It means that you're building something new. And when you understand boundaries correctly, you stop seeing them as limitation. You start seeing them as protection. You realize boundaries, they don't block your calling, they preserve your calling. Because what God is building in your life needs space to grow. And if everything has access to you, nothing will be sustained. You don't need to do more. You need to protect what God has already given you and what matters. Because calling may open a door, but boundaries are what keep you aligned once you walk through that door. So as you move through this week, don't just look at what you're doing. Look at what you're allowing. Pay attention to where your time is going, where your energy is being pulled, and where you feel stretched beyond what you were called to do, what you can sustain even. And instead of trying to fix everything at once, start small. Ask God to show you one area that you need to create a boundary, just one. One place where you need to say no, maybe a place where you need to pull back a little bit. Find a place that He's going to protect so that He can build what He wants to build. And trust that those small decisions will begin to create a space for clarity, a space for alignment, a space for what actually matters. Because your life is not meant to be carried by everything. It's meant to be built with intention.